Hello and welcome to Hearth Matters with me, Catherine Lucas Damer, and my increasingly pregnant and beautiful co host, Erin Zuma. Today, our guest is Catherine Pakaluk, an economist and social scientist and the author of Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. And she's a mother of 8. Yes, you heard that correctly. In the age of 1.6 babies per American family, 8 children is an anomaly. Catherine became curious about the outliers, the women who, like her, had chosen to have large families. How were these women different? And why were they making this choice? I mean, the answers that Catherine discovered in interviews with 55 women may surprise you. In defiance of the modern feminist narratives that warn against the loss of self that can occur as a mother, these women have, in fact, found themselves in having children, in the transcendence of self in service to giving rise to and caring for other human beings. You know, a few years ago, I might have been resistant to Catherine's book because most, but not all of the women she talks to are religious, and I think of myself as mostly secular. But increasingly, I'm noticing the dysfunction of a rugged, individualistic, secular culture that places self and materialism at the center of meaning making. Catherine's storytelling helped me to see the beauty and the potential of a world where family is at the center of a meaningful life and a healthy culture. There really is something here worth exploring. I left the conversation with an even deeper conviction that many of the solutions to our modern ills will not be found in the public sphere. The solutions we seek must begin from within and with a reordering of our priorities that honors the sacredness of the cycle of life. It's so wonderful to have another Catherine on our podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's great. I love Catherine's of all types.
So your book is so rich with information, it's hard to know where to start our conversation.
Mm.
So let's begin with your work and your reason for writing this book. You're an
Mhm.
economist and a mother of 6. Is that right?
So I have 8 children.
8 children, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No, that's
And
okay.
I apologize. You wanted to study family as an
Mhm.
economic unit.
Yeah.
And you say in the introduction of your book, there is no more economically significant question than where people come from, and nothing more deeply informs the way we order our lives than the
Mhm.
first society we experience, the family.
Right.
Why did you think the family unit is, why do you think it's not studied more? And why did you decide to approach it from a qualitative rather than a quantitative perspective?
Yeah. Both great questions. Why is it not studied more? Let me start there.
Yeah.
So I could maybe start with a cheap answer, which which I think you'll understand the cheap answer, why it's a little bit cheap. One way to say it would be that women are naturally more attuned to domestic life and to the family. And the shape of certainly most of the social sciences and most academic research has been informed by things that the men consider important. And so don't hear that as coming from some, place of denouncing men. But I do think that's one of the things that women bring to the research table is a kind of like, well, wait a second here. I actually think this is really important. So I think that's one reason. I don't think that's the most important reason, but I think it would not be wrong to lead with that. I think the second thing is that the family is a group of persons, right? So that sounds like a really obvious thing to say. The family is a group of persons, and they're related in a very special way, in a way that actually turns out to be pretty difficult to define, right? So, I mean, just let me give you an example what I mean. If you say that one of the things that you commit to do when you marry somebody is to take care of them forever, that turns out to be difficult to come up with a legal concept that covers that, right? So now so it sounds a little bit like maybe like your property. That's something that you own that you have to take care of until you sell it. But your family is not your property, right? It's not property. You can't sell it and trade it away. We don't have adequate conceptions legally it's very difficult to do this. And so, if I'm going to transition from this legal problem to the social science problem, we have barely come up with adequate ways to describe what a person is. And so, defining how to think about a family as a unit, right? That's something that's been just, well, I'll just say methodologically very difficult.
Mhm.
And so a lot of economists will use the language of methodological individualism. They'll say, well, we're not individualist. We don't think people are like this, but we don't have another approach. We have to pretend as if people are individuals, like simpliciter, right? So I think I don't think it's easy to overstate how problematic this is, right? We don't know how to treat a family unit as a decision maker in the economy, even though that's exactly what we think is important, is that like men and women who build families together, they make difficult and interesting decisions together. And we sometimes have split that as economists. We say, oh, well, the women are out buying groceries or the men are doing this in the workforce. And we all get that that's kind of it's a reductionist kind of view, but it's difficult to do something different. So I
Mhm.
just want to say there's the cheap answer. And then there's the kind of like, I think, thornier answer. It's a very hard thing to do, especially in the way that social science likes to do things today, which is more quantitative. You're going to quantify something, right? So this was your second question, which you asked about, which was why the qualitative? Well, basically for this reason. So I'd say a couple of things about that. One is that I was interested in doing this thing, which is focusing on people who look really different from the people around them, right? So I was just thinking the other day, if you witnessed a dangerous situation, some kind of a terror attack or something, the sort of thing we are maybe too familiar with, and you saw like, well, everybody runs away from danger, but one person turns around and faces the danger, and you'd want to know like what motivates you, what drives
Mm.
you, why did you not run away from the dangerous thing? Is it likely that it's already something so unusual that we're not likely to have a predetermined way to describe that in a quantitative way. And even if we thought eventually we could size it up, we could get like a courage meter. We would figure out, okay, here's a way to size up courage, right, or whatever that is. We would probably have to talk to a lot of people who exercised courage, and then start to think about what does it look like to record courage and recommend it to people and develop it in people. So I thought, well, what I need to do is talk to people who are like that. They're really unusual people. I don't know what I'm going to hear, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to hear things that we don't have language for. Because if we did, it would already be in the surveys. We would already be out asking people these things. So I didn't begin with the qualitative approach because I think quantitative work has no value, or it's terrible or always wrong to sum people up with a number, but because I thought there are probably things we haven't heard that we need to hear, grapple with them, and then think what that could tell us about what future research we might want to do.
Hmm.
Mm. Yeah. You say that in a two-child world, an
Hmm.
eight-child family deserves an explanation, and that's
Hmm.
sort of what sets you forward. You also go on to interview 55, I believe I
Hmm.
have that right,
Yep.
college-educated women with 5 or more children. So why those numbers, 55, 5, and the
Hmm.
lens
Yeah.
on those with college degrees?
Yeah. Great. Okay. So I'll try to remember all three and you can nudge me if I forget one. 55 was really just determined by my budget.
Mm.
So it's not entirely free to go around and
Yeah.
fly to different cities and talk to people. So I was really blessed at the beginning of this study to find some eager supporters. And so I received a small grant to do this work. And so that seemed about the sweet spot. I mean, I wasn't targeting 55 in particular, but somewhere
Mm.
between 50 and 70 was sort of my goal. I wanted to at least hit 50.
Mm.
So that's the quick answer to that. Now, I would also want to say, when you know that what you're going to do is sit down and talk to people for 2 hours, maybe, and then produce a transcript of that thing, and then work through 50 or 60 of those and try to pull that data into one story, it's probably good I stopped at 55. Right? So it was sort of hard enough. So that was where the 55 came from. It was really a matter of funding and the logistics. So that was your first question. Why five or more children?
Yes.
That one's easy to answer. in a sense, it was arbitrary. I could have picked. So I wanted to talk to people doing something different, the people running towards the danger or what everybody else ready. I just, whatever that description is, people doing something different. The typical birth rate today in the United States, if we just took the average, is about 1.6 or 1.7. So you could have said 2 would be different. I mean, but it's, maybe not statistically easy to discern. 3 would have been a little bit above that. 4 starts to sound like, okay, now you've got people who are probably doing something different. So I thought probably 4 or 5 was the number. Um, and again, not because I think of that as a standard of excellence or anything like that, but just that I wanted to find people who really looked like they had diverted from the crowd and done something different. And I reasoned that, well, I kind of looked at the distributions. It turned out that 5 children really put me in a kind of 5% zone, and I thought that was kind of a nice number. That was part of it. And the other part was that, well, 5 makes it exceedingly unlikely that you got a 4th because you were trying for a girl, trying for a boy. So, yeah, because, when you're out selecting people, you don't get to ask them a lot of questions. You just get to ask, did you have your children on purpose? Would you be interested in being interviewed? Those sorts of things. So I really wanted to avoid getting people who had sort of had their children on purpose, but because they were trying for a girl or a boy, which is certainly something we know happens a lot. So that was it. But I think I could have gone with 4. Probably would have been, pretty fruitful as well. But so yeah, arbitrary, not a clean line there. And then your third question, you said,
Yeah, it's actually about that selection
yeah,
criteria.
yeah. Oh, the college educated.
Yeah, and I'm
Was
going to
that it?
tack one on there because
Sure.
did you get to select for religious or not? That's
Mhm.
what ends up sort of playing
Yes.
out, but was that okay?
Yes. So that's exactly how this works. So the criterion were 5 or more children, and I did want to speak to women who are college educated. Again, not because I think of that as any sort of standard for human life or excellence, but because that's the tension we see in the demographic picture that's unfolding. Is that it really looks like the more education people have, the fewer children they have. And what's going on there? Is that causal? And what does that tension look like? So I thought, well, that's the tension we're seeing. So I want to really zero in on that. Again, not a standard of excellence in my mind. So that was it. To respond to the call for interview subjects, I posted flyers in different places. You had to have 5 or more with your spouse and be college educated. So that was the net I cast. When I recruited people, I let them follow a QR code to a survey, a little like a Survey Monkey type thing. It was anonymous. Well, we had an email address, but we didn't ask them about their names. And then that's where we were looking for religious affiliation, kind of what they did, like what their career credentials looked like did they have any work, racial and ethnic background? Because at that point, now you've got your selection on the 5 children and the college education. But I really did want diversity in
Right.
religious background. And that was part of the story was like, well, are they all kind of religiously brainwashed or are they like, and what does that even look like? What does it mean to have a religious reason for having children? Like
Mm,
I actually didn't have any of the language I now have when I started this study.
wow.
So yeah, I really was looking for that. And I'll say it as also explicitly, I say it in the book, I really did hope that I would find some women who were not necessarily in a church or practicing any particular religion. I know they exist out there. It turns out they're harder to find,
Mm.
certainly on the budget that I had. So I didn't find anybody who didn't check a religious box. But I did write about the least religious person that I met. And
Um,
since writing the book and publishing it, actually, a couple of people have reached out to me. One woman in particular, whose name I won't share, but she wrote to me and she said, I'm that person. I'm the person, my husband and I don't practice any faith, but we have 5 children and we're not sure we'll have another. And I said, hey, can I interview in a couple months?
yeah.
So yeah, I did earnestly want to know. But yeah, so I think that answers your question.
Yeah.
Why did you call the book Hannah's Children?
hmm So I really, well, first of all, it's not something I thought about before I did the study. And you want to know, I kind of knew something about my own life, but I just didn't know to what extent my own experiences and patterns, like was it generalizable or am I completely different? And one of the things that came across very loud and clear, because I'm looking for motive out there, I'm looking for why did you do this? What I heard kind of on day one and all the way through was that almost nobody, there's a couple, but really almost nobody said, well, I got married with this goal of having, 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 children. So I couldn't tell this story as if it was a story about people who wanted big families, because that's actually not what happened. It's not how it worked out. And so as I struggled through the narratives, I thought, well, there's a couple of notes here that were common. And one was the note that women saw their children as gifts, not always from day one, but
Mhm.
as desirable blessings from God, and not sort of objects of choice in necessarily a kind of modern sense. So I thought, well, that was kind of loud and clear. These weren't people who, got married and just wanted to have enormous families, at least not at the beginning. And so the element that I wanted to highlight was this element of blessing, right? Blessing, gift, a kind of openness to God's providence in your life through motherhood. Right. So there's lots of ways you could be open to God's providence. I thought, well, that's really the central message of this story.
Mhm.
And so how do you sum that up? What's the way to sum that up? And I thought it's an attitude that I heard more than a kind of consumer demand type story. Of course, the language of demand becomes important in my book, but it was an attitude more than a target or a goal. And I thought,
Mhm.
okay, what's the attitude? The attitude is the attitude of the biblical Hannah. That came to me really, it was a kind of inspiration. I was just struggling, like, what am I going to say here? And so I rushed home after I had this thought, and I opened the Bible and I thought, I got to reread the story of Hannah. And why Hannah? Well, she's barren and she prays so desperately to have a child. She sees children as part of God's plan, but also something that God is kind of author of life in that sense. If you're not blessed, you know, the only resource you have is to ask God for that blessing. So she's really inspiring. And then I really kind of fell off my chair. If I had ever heard it before, I had completely forgotten it. That after she brings Samuel back to the temple, she the priest Eli says, well, we've got to bless her for this act of faith. This is outstanding. We've never seen anything like this. And then God intercedes in her life and she receives 5 more children. And I thought this is the archetype. This is the type of this attitude that I heard. So that's why the biblical Hannah, that's why the Hannah's children. So I thought, what is the way to think about these children? These are women who have the heart of a Hannah in a certain sense. And it's not
Mhm.
perfect, but I thought it was really good. I talked to mostly Christian and Jewish women. So I liked that Hannah was someone who could unite us across our faiths and was a kind of common point across the Christian faiths that I engage with. So, and then of course, one of the lead characters in the book, I give her the name Hannah to try to
Right.
work with that. Yeah. So there's, of course, the women in the book, except for one, they all have a pseudonym, right? So, um,
I was really taken by the fact that most of the women you interviewed went from 0 to 2 babies desired
mhm,
to as many as possible. And
yeah,
it got me curious about how a woman's age factors into
yeah,
the birth gap,
mhm,
or really more
yeah,
precisely, their desired fertility at different age points or
yeah,
brackets.
right,
I would imagine it's, that women at 20 and 40, maybe they're looking to have 1 or 2, but that women in the middle would be on kind of the upper end of a bell, that they would want
yeah,
more children. But I'm
yeah,
curious, do we see those trends? What are the trends around desired fertility?
yeah. So I'm not aware, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm not aware of research where we're doing kind of like check-ins with people about their desired fertility at different stages in life. My understanding is that um, most of the interviews about desired fertility, we usually ask women in their younger years, close to college or after that. That's an interesting question. It would be interesting to see if they change or show any kind of major change over the life course. I mean, obviously, you're raising a deep point, which is that when we ask people about their fertility desires, we do ask them different types of questions. One question we ask is, what do you think is the right or best number of children for a person to have? We ask a version of that question.
Mm,
And that's kind of sometimes called fertility ideal. That we also sometimes ask people, how many children do you expect to have?
mm,
If you think about that for a quick second, you realize like that could be really different. Like I might say, I think it's ideal for a family to have 3 bedrooms in their house. But if you ask me how many bedrooms I expect to have, I might say 2, right? And that's
mm,
just a kind of, I don't know, a difference between what I think is ideal and what I think I might achieve in my lifetime. And so we do see that we kind of have to work with these different ways we ask the question. And then we do sometimes ask, how many children do you want to have? We will use that language of want. So it's all out there. I think we mostly target younger women with those things. But this question of, the difference between what you think would be ideal and what you expect. And you just mentioned this kind of birth gap that we talk about. I think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the next decade or more.
right.
And why? Because there's kind of a deep question about how seriously we should take people's desires. And now, obviously, I'm not the person to say like we shouldn't care that people don't get as many children as they say they want. I think it's really important that people are able to have children if they would like to have children. But what we're trying to tease out is in an era of really unprecedented reproductive control. Now, I suppose there's somebody out there who might disagree with me and say that like there's all this unmet need for contraception and that sort of thing. But I think we're pretty far down this road of like it's pretty easy for people to sort of map out their lives. Why is it that women are falling short of their desired number of children?
Right.
And the problem for most of us looking at that number, like this birth gap of maybe about one child, is that there's no good answers. And what I mean is we don't like any of the answers. Like the best explanations we can come up with are not good ones.
Right.
One type of answer would be, well, women want more children, but they're just constrained in some way. Like
Mm,
something's stopping them. Well, then that sounds like, well, what's stopping them? I mean, aren't we all very, I don't know, enabled or empowered, right? Aren't we empowered? So then you'd want to say, if you were like a very classic sort of mainstream feminist, you would want to say, well, maybe we think we've lifted all of these restrictions in women's lives. We haven't really achieved it. This is a tragic situation, right? So you have women who want something and they can't achieve it, and they're now put that way, you'd say, well, this should be like a new feminist rallying cry, right? Would be like, what are the hidden sources of constraint?
yep.
But there's another way to think about it, which is equally problematic, right? And the other way to think about it is that their statements of wanting a certain number of children at a certain age in their lives, they're not things we should take any more seriously than a fairly universal desire to lose more weight or get in shape or, take up pottery, right? Because we're doing these surveys, we're asking people a question about an abstract desire. It's like a thing that, like, you ask me what kind of car I'd like, I would tell you a car that I don't have. Maybe,
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
But we wouldn't consider it a big tragedy if we, like all these women want to lose weight and they're not losing weight. Is this a big, and we would say, well, if they didn't lose weight, it's probably because like other things are in the way, right? There's other things you also value, like you value your time and you don't want to spend millions of hours running marathons or walking around the neighborhood or whatever it might be. Or, you have a job or a career that you really do love. In other words, desires are over here, and then there's reality. And in reality, we have to trade off the multiple good things that we want. And children are one of the good things that we want, but we also want, our careers, we want our families, we want to travel and make our husbands happy and do the things that they would like to do. And sometimes the timing doesn't work out. And so you can see right away, like you have this birth gap problem where you go like, okay, it doesn't look that good. Is it a story about some kind of deep incapacity of women to be really empowered to achieve the thing that they want? Or is it a more mundane story about like everything else in human life, right? Like I can just list you right now, 20 things I've said for years I'd like to do. Writing a book was one of them, and it took me an awful long time. So, yeah, so I think that's why I say, like, this is exactly what we have to talk about.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you point to expressive individualism.
Mhm.
And we all know this is at the core of, the secular culture in the West, which means we prioritize self-realization and personal growth and feelings over the group's welfare.
Mhm.
And many of the women you interviewed rejected what they called, see if I can find the quote here, the customized life, where the number and timing of children were fitted to a narrative of self-identity.
Mhm.
And when they spoke of the self-sacrifice of childbearing and rearing, they didn't lose their sense of self,
Right.
but instead they found themselves in having children. And uh, this
Mhm.
perspective runs so counter to second wave and really third and fourth wave feminist narratives that, felt that women couldn't find fulfillment as mothers. Why do you think this narrative that runs so deep in modern
Mhm.
culture didn't grab the women you interviewed?
Yeah. I think it's a great question to ask, and it's the kind of question that illustrates why this had to be a conversation, right?
Mhm.
So these are people that if you were to pose them a quick survey question, they might have said, "Well, I don't think of my self-identity as that high on the list," or something, and that would have just sounded terrible. As it is, and I'm gonna answer your question maybe fully, but as it is, I here's another reaction I get. My email is full of these great reactions. A young woman who is in college at an elite school, and again, I can't name her. She wrote to me and she said, "I'm somewhere between being full of admiration for the women that you interviewed, but also sometimes having this deep-seated, almost re revulsion for the kinds of things I'm hearing,
Mhm.
because they're putting themselves last in ways that I think I don't agree with." But she also said I was really it was admirable too, right? So, I think that I was delighted by that. I actually thought that's exactly, uh, in a sense, the proposition that's on the table. It's like that's exactly what I think it's good for us to think about. And if it's fair to say, I mean, for Christians, we're going through Holy Week this week and thinking about Easter. And, I'm thinking about the words of St. Paul that the cross is a scandal, right? That the cross is a scandal. But I think that that's true in general, that a lot of times we might look at things that seem idealistic, but we just get a little bit depressed about repulsed by the sacrifice that's involved, right? So that's like it's a really human reaction. You asked me why I didn't think that they went along with that. So it's important to mention that I don't have in my study people who bumped into the hardships of motherhood and then dropped out, like said, you know what, this is too much. So, in a sense, I'm seeing just half of the picture, right? Which is that some people did just say, this is too much. I don't want to let go of myself in this way. So, I don't know what that looks like on the other side because those are the people I didn't interview. And I wouldn't even assume that they would have sort of symmetrical reasons. But I think ultimately what I heard, why why were you able to muster this courage? What I heard was a kind of story about surrender and grace. I think that's the language I'd want to put on it. A resource inside that many of them explicitly pointed to coming from a life of faith, that they couldn't explain why they had it, but they knew it was supernatural or beyond them. So I'm thinking of language like in the second chapter where Hannah says, if I thought about who I used to be, this wouldn't have made sense. My life doesn't make sense to who I was then.
Yeah.
But of course, she's described this very profound religious conversion. And she says, well, I thought that this is what God wanted me to do as a Jewish woman. And so of course she draws a lot of strength from her faith. So ultimately I'd have to say that what I heard across the board was a story of I think a kind of grace, but also a grace to surrender, attachment to things that did cost them something to leave behind. And no, that not all the stories are desperately sad. I mean, in that sense, I mean, we had different language, like, okay, some of those things are on the back burner for a little while, and then they're gonna come back again. And I could relate to that. I thought, well, with some of those things that I'd like to have But the role that faith played in those conflicting desires for the women I interviewed seemed to me to be that it helped them prioritize the things that were in conflict. So you go like,
Right.
"Well, I'd like to do these 10 things, but I'm gonna do this first because faith gives me a sense that this is important, most important for now."
Right.
Catherine,
Yeah.
do you,
Mhm,
to follow up on that,
mhm.
you talk also about, how we make choices.
Yeah.
And, even like from a secular perspective, I wonder as we're trying to make choices that often we're making choices that hopefully will lead to a path
Mhm,
of the least amount of suffering
mhm.
and the most
Yes.
amount of joy.
Mhm.
That's what we're all we're trying to make those decisions, it
Yeah.
seems.
Yeah.
And I think anybody, especially older women, women my age, we
Yeah.
start to recognize as we get older, the material pursuits don't really
Mm.
result in much that is meaningful in your life,
Yeah.
and that it is the things that you made sacrifices for that end up feeling a lot more meaningful to the human experience. And
Right.
I'm really compelled by that for non-religious women, I think,
Mhm.
who are thinking about this as well. What do you
Right.
think about that?
Yeah. So I couldn't agree more, but I want to point out, I think a difficulty. A difficulty is that I think people don't easily, I'll say, they don't easily choose hard things just because it makes them better.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though we all look back, right, it's like, "Oh, that terrible thing that happened," like, I lost my job at a time, or, whatever it might be, or a terrible illness. We recognize later the growth that it produced in us, but I think few of us would have been so brave as to, like, "Sign me up. I wanna be sick for 3
Mm.
months. I wanna go through that."
Right.
And I think there's something of that phenomenon happening with children. It that it's difficult to choose children merely because we know that we'll become better or that it will have all this meaning in later. Even if we know it and we agree with it, we go, yeah, absolutely. It's like St. Augustine, right? Like, God make me good, but not yet, or something, right? It's like you agree with it. You go, yeah, I think living a life of like religious continence would be great. Objectively, I'd probably be a saint, but I'm not really ready for that
Yeah.
yet. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I feel like that's a piece of the thing we're living through now, which is if you don't live in a world of really great family planning, right? You get married. Why? Because you want to become a better person? No, because you're just like, wow, I'm in love and this is great. And I want to spend all my time with this person. And, marital intimacy is going to be something I'm looking forward to. You don't have to twist my arm, right?
Right.
Right. But in a world of, let's just say, a more old fashioned approach, you get married and you're not pursuing becoming better through suffering. You're pursuing all those goods. And then what happens, of course, is that, like, by nature, children are baked into that desire to form a family with somebody and you're drawn to those good things. But then the child comes and you're like, well, yeah, this was pretty hard, but man, like, how rewarding it's been. And so choice in that choice dilemma, that, or the kind of the moment of choice that you're just asking about, I think that's a little bit of the story of the place we're in now. So
Mhm.
we don't get married and just welcome children immediately. That's not the norm anymore. We get married and we wait till the right time to have a child. And it's like me standing next to a cold swimming pool. Like, I put my toe in, I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not doing it. But I have to be pushed into the pool. I'm just too chicken to jump into a cold pool. I just hate it. And so what is the right time to have a child when you know that it's gonna be like jumping into the cold swimming pool? I feel like that's like a little sort of change that might actually be monumental. You have this whole society, right? Like, standing on the edge of the pool waiting for the right moment,
Yeah.
and like, you wanna just do it, but you can't.
It's a great
Mhm.
analogy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There are so many quotes that I want to feature on this podcast and sort of broadcast to myself at 20 or 25. Really,
Yeah,
25 is probably the
yeah.
sweet spot. And any woman who's listening to this
Mhm.
podcast, I want them to hear this one because it was most impactful to me.
Okay.
It's when I stopped looking in at myself And I started looking at these humans and loving these people so much and them and their suffering and what they are going through that I started healing.
Hmm.
And, I so many women in their 20s are depressed.
Yeah.
And I think a symptom of that depression or a side effect is that they think that they can't have children unless they've figured themselves out.
Right.
I know that I've been there,
Yeah.
and I can attest
Hmm.
to this saving effect of focusing on others.
Yeah.
Like when I decided it's time for me to get married and have children,
Hmm.
there was a little bit of God in there, but it was really
Hmm.
a self serving moment in the
Yeah.
sense that I realized that if I was focusing on the others, on
Hmm.
caring for, and it doesn't have to be babies, but in
Yeah.
my case, it was babies,
Yeah.
neighbors, friends, elders. That is probably what's going to satisfy your soul.
Yeah.
That it just there's something about getting out of yourself and into the
Right.
world and seeing those rewards. Do you think there's some truth there?
Yeah. I mean, that's why that quote is there. And, I just could, it's like something that I heard. And it does kind of come back to this question like, do we do the right things for the right reasons? And I think most of us don't do the right things for the right reasons. I think this is kind of like the structure of life and it speaks to our age too. I mean, I think as we get older, hopefully if we live a life full of hard things, like we can do hard things, then we start to learn that actually, you can do the hard things for the right reasons. But when we're young, we do the hard things usually for partially self-interested reasons. I mean, I think most of us probably wouldn't go to work if we didn't have to work.
Definitely.
And is that like the right reason to go to work, right? I mean, of course, there's all these virtues that come about from working, and it could be noble, and we could be trying to do our part for society, right? Those are all things that are true, but we
Hmm.
don't work for that reason. And I think that's definitely right what you said, that I think we're kind of bundles of self-deception when we're young. I mean, I definitely was. Self-deception, also just promises we probably can't keep.
Right.
Right? Like you think about what it would mean and the kind of person you were, at least, I mean, I don't want to put it on you, but for sure me, the kind of person I was when I got married. I mean, I had no business promising to like follow through on a commitment for a lifetime when you look at my background or the things that I was weak in all kinds of ways, right? So you go like, well, how are you going to become the person who can keep the promises you made? And it's probably that this what would you call it? You said focusing on other people, but it's a kind of forced experience where you're just required to come out of yourself and focus on other people. And then somehow that experience, quite apart from your own virtue, because you don't have any, but
Yep.
you just
Hmm.
let you go ahead and you go along with it. And it somehow makes you into the kind of person that you promised you would be.
Hmm.
Right? It's like
Yes.
kind of like magic.
Yeah. Right. Just
So
just commit.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, yeah, so I think it's really it does raise a kind of deep question about how we become the people we want to be. And I think intentions aren't enough.
Yes.
Intending to
And
be better isn't going to do the job. Yeah.
and expressive individualism, I keep coming back to
Yeah.
that as we're kind of out in the cold in a
Yeah.
way when we're just focused on ourselves and we don't see the continuity
Yeah.
of ancestral lineage and also
Right.
reaching out into the future. And one of the women in, I think it was Hannah,
Mhm.
who you interviewed, she talked about how, and I think you did too, about how
Mhm.
giving rise to another human life, which is a beautiful way of
Yeah.
saying that. It's so
Yeah.
gorgeous.
Right.
Unlocked gifts of love and sacrifice from their own
Mhm.
own ancestors. God, I
Right.
never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
While allowing them to reach towards the infinite.
Yeah.
And something in my psyche just and my soul clicked when I got chills when I read that. I don't know
Mhm.
why it took me so long to make that connection because now
Yeah.
when I think about it in those terms, I feel like I'm part of something bigger than me.
Yeah.
And, I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit more about this connection as a chain that links the human family? Can you expand on that theme a
Yeah,
little bit more?
for sure. well, you're not alone. When I sat in Hannah's living room and heard her say those things, I mean, I remember just thinking, that's astonishing, right? Like, I could definitely say when I got married and decided to have my first child, and I wasn't thinking about a chain of infinity at all. But sitting here today, my first grandchild is coming in a month, and so, it's this starts to sound a lot more important. Yeah, so Hannah talked about how before she reverted, she's a Jewish woman, and she was raised to kind of a very secular Jewish family. But she talked about before she converted, she'd tried to find meaning and purpose and all kinds of other things, and in particular, she was drawn to the concept of nirvana and some of these kind of Eastern meditations and things, and she just said, she was kind of searching for something infinite and big. And she said as she converted and became drawn to her ancestral religion, it became clear to her, she said it just hit her that children were the way you tie in. It's like the tie-in. There's this chain of humanity and you need to link into it, right? And for the first time in history now, we live in a time where, you can just not link into it. You could just choose not to. Childlessness is one of the intentional childlessness is one of the main ways that the total fertility rate is declining. So vast increases in the number of people opting. In fact, my social media sometimes prompts me with these ads, and I get these like child free by choice ads just because I think I write about children a lot. So yeah, she talked about this chain of infinity, which to me was a totally welcome and completely new and yeah, kind of hair in my arms kind of thing. And I I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I knew I wanted to feature that and kind of but it represented so many things that I heard in general that it did become a kind of a leitmotif for this story. Part of it was you talked about expressive individualism, and part of it was like a nice way to point out like the link in the chain isn't a non-entity. Like the chain isn't a blob, right? You don't get kind of melted into the pot of all the pieces of metal where we can't see the chain anymore. The chain and each link has to be strong and has to be her, who she is.
Mm.
So the chain, it's just a nice way of describing like, okay, your individual person, your personhood doesn't dissolve or go away. Right? In fact, that you're strong is really important, right? We know what the meaning of the weakest link is, right? So I thought it was lovely. So it kind of got at this idea that it didn't mean to deny your personhood, and that you didn't have to be weaker or less if you have more people depending on you, something we heard from a lot of people. And then it kind of challenges these two meanings of freedom, right? One meaning of freedom would be no obligations, right? You're just free, like there are no strings on me, Pinocchio. That's one kind of freedom. But another type of freedom would be essentially kind of making a commitment to other people because you're free, right? And it's yours because you you made that choice. But it needs to be your choice. Like I would be, I think, less of a good wife to my husband if I was somehow forced into this marriage, or I was, well, I'm just doing this because, everybody said it was the right thing to do, right? It's the gift is the gift because it was the free gift. Right. So
Mm.
the chain got at all of these different things. And then last but not least, it really reminded me of this idea in Tocqueville where he wonders about how democracy in America is going to fare without the aristocracy. Because he says, well, when you have this kind of free society, which is an experiment, the problem is you run the risk of people kind of seeing themselves as these like unattached persons. And he says the good thing about aristocracy is it linked everybody in a chain from the king down to the lowest level. And it just made me wonder. And of course, I'm not a political theorist. I'm not here to offer a fancy new, like post Tocquevillian idea. But I couldn't help putting those two things side by side and say, well, maybe we could have a chance at having a free society that wouldn't dissolve into expressive individualism if more people embrace the idea of this kind of the chain of the ancestral family. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, generally
Hmm.
speaking, that family is egalitarian and communitarian and hierarchical all at the
Mhm,
same time. So
mhm.
when family is not prioritized culturally, how do you think that that affects,
Yeah.
our broader social order and, even our democracy?
Yeah, right. Well, at least, again, I'm not a political theorist. I'm not here to offer like a complete political theory, but I would like to think of myself right now as kind of running out into the public square and saying, hey, wait, wait, wait. A lot of the disorders that we are putting our finger on, and we think about all the different cultural critics out there, both on the left side and the right side, they may have their roots in the ways we live our family lives. And so again, is this a male perspective that people are more interested in theories than the domestic hearth, in the home? I
Mhm.
don't know why some of my friends and colleagues who are, equally concerned about the state of the country are less interested in the sources of these things in the home. But at least I want to say I'm, out there saying I think this could be really important. So just to kind of answer your question one way, I mean, the women talked a lot about the way in which growing up with more siblings they were observing in their own families seemed to give them an advantage trying to cultivate pro-social virtues in their children. And I thought, wait a minute. Okay, so if I put on my other hat and I go look at the kinds of things that, I'm thinking about like Ezra Klein's book about polarization. So
Mhm.
Ezra is somebody who I think is a really astute social observer, not somebody who shares my religious tradition, but somebody who I think is often very, very
Mm.
interesting. Or I think about Ross Douthat's book about kind of some of the difficulties of luxury in society. And I started to point to all of these things, like I was seeing them in the testimonies, and I just kept thinking, wait a second, like there's all of these things that people are commenting on. They are real problems, but they maybe have
Mhm.
another explanation. So I would say at least a complementary source. I mean,
Right.
isn't a society in which the typical human being in society is an only child or has only one sibling? Isn't that a different society from a society in which everybody has 3 or 4 siblings? It seems like like almost once you say it out loud, you're like, "Well, yeah, I guess that would be a really different society." Yeah.
Yeah.
The smaller family begets smaller families.
Mhm. Yeah, and you can see
Interesting.
that in generations, by the way. I'm thinking of a particular case that I know, and again, you're trying not to name names. The 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 great-grandmother immigrated from Eastern Europe, and she had she started her family in Eastern Europe and came over here and finished her family. There's I think she had 9 or 10 children altogether, and then her her daughter had 3, and then her daughter had 0.
Mhm.
So, the
Mhm.
3 looks like a very reasonable position. It looks like, well, my mom wasn't happy, she was always overburdened, she had a terrible, difficult life. 3 is sensible.
Right.
But then somehow 3 begets 0 or 1 like it so as you say, like, it shrinks, it doesn't sustain itself somehow, that vision of family.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it may have something to do with the fact that you're not coming in close contact with young children because all your
Mhm.
siblings,
Right,
if you're 3, are all around your age, right?
right,
But
right.
when you're 15 and now a new baby's there,
Yeah,
that must be a very different experience for a
I
child
I would
or for
think
young.
so, and this was a great thing that came to my mind, I just hadn't really thought about it before was, um and like I mentioned at the beginning, my son is gonna have a baby in April, God willing, and but my son grew up, when he was 13, 14, 15, just babies were in the house all the time. So it's not foreign to him, and he kind of knows, like, actually, it could be pretty fun to have little a little one, and, he used to take them around trick or treating. Like, I haven't had to take somebody trick or treating in, a long time.
Yeah.
Because why? Because the teenagers wanna do it. Why do they wanna do it? Well, they actually wanna go trick or treating, but they're kind of afraid to admit that they do, so if they can take the little ones along, but, like, what comes from that is kinda magical, right? So you have these, like, 16, 17, 18-year-old boys who recognize, man, when you can take kids trick or treat but that stands in for so many things, right? What joy there is in introducing little children to the joys of life. Like, don't you wanna be the person to do that?
Mhm.
So
Mm.
I'm always fond of noticing the ways that our children interpret life experiences that they have in relation to what they wanna do with their kids when they grow up. Like, you'll hear
Right.
the 8-year-old say, "I'm gonna do these fun things with my kids." You're like, "You're 8, you are a kid, but you're already thinking about wanting to share experiences with your children." I think that's an untapped, interesting thing,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah, I always, people would accuse my mother of being a little off her rocker when
Mhm,
she had her 4th child at 38, 39.
mhm.
She had me at 26. So
Wow. Yeah,
Shoot.
my 18-year-old sister
yeah,
graduates from high school in June, and my mother will have her first granddaughter by then. So
amazing,
it's
amazing.
it's really fun the way that age gap
Yeah,
sort of informs the
yeah,
way that you look at children and the way that,
right.
yeah, you're gonna end up keeping them throughout your life, right? You
Yeah,
don't really have a time where you don't get to nurture. You're
right,
going right to grandma mode, which is
right,
amazing.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Well, in thinking about the economics of this, since you're an
Mhm,
economist, for most of human history, children made sense economically,
mhm,
and they don't anymore.
mm,
How much do you think separating home and work had to do with this development? And do you think that maybe by reuniting home and work, and that's
mhm.
kind of where a lot of
Yeah,
our work is centered
yeah,
around, could help revalue the economics of the family unit?
yeah. Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, goodness. So
Yeah.
interesting. What you need to have, of course, if you have home and work united in such a way that it's economically sensible to have children or more children, you need it to be the case that it's all right, or it's all right for children to contribute to the economic project of the household.
Mm.
So from the perspective of our current, like, so if we reunite work and home, I mean, the question is, do we think it's okay to, like, exempt children from 8-hour school days and have them, like, produce
Mhm.
stuff? That's the question. I don't know if people are there in general yet. I'd be there in the sense that the other hat that I wear as an economist is education. And we know that the things we think contribute to good outcomes in education are often incorrect. So more time spent in school does not necessarily translate into better outcomes. More money spent on schools doesn't translate into better outcomes. And so thinking about the types of things you guys do, it's been a puzzle to a lot of people. Why is it that homeschooling or home education is so good at what it does? Like, what it seems maybe like it shouldn't be so good. Because it doesn't fit the normal metrics. It doesn't it look if you're thinking about a school as a factory, um, it should be like better machines, better books, better teachers, like that should get you good outcomes. It doesn't work out that way. And so I guess I would say I think you might be right, but we'd have to allow, I mean, if we're really going to go back to a time when children were economically valuable, we'd have to like have them working. Now I don't mean that in a bad way, but like I mean, I certainly sometimes have my children working in the house in different ways. But we'd have to kind of go a pretty long way down that road to think about the time when you looked at your 8-year-old son and thought, "At last, I have somebody else who's a farmhand." Right?
Right.
Right,
So
right.
I think it's gotta heal. It's something could be very healing about what you're talking about, but I would like us to be more creative about reinventing the school day, or how we think about that
Mm.
could be very good.
And maybe even infusing the things that maybe they're helping around the family business with into lessons, about how to create a profit and loss,
Right.
Excel
Oh,
spreadsheet for
100%.
something,
Yeah.
right? Like real life lessons. And I had a restaurant for a number of years in
Mhm.
Germany, and my son loved to work in the restaurant starting at
Mm.
like
Mhm.
10.
Yes.
He thought that was the coolest thing in the world to be like cleaning
Yeah.
glasses,
Right.
you know, on the cool little dishwasher thing we had. And I think kids generally we're not talking about putting them to work in the fields
N
and,
right. No, no.
60-hour work weeks, but some combination,
Yes.
of the
Yes.
2 seems like it could be really beneficial to families.
to families, I think, and also to the way we think about education, or if we think about education as the formation of character and formation of personality, which is, of course, what we want. We want people to develop in their personalities. We tend to think of work as being uh, something that you're either working or you're studying, or you're either working or you're becoming educated, right? But I would think, well, no, no, no. Actually, work plays an enormous role in character formation. And so if perhaps, and I'm not ready to concede the point completely, but if perhaps in the old days we did too much work and too little education, formal education for children, we could certainly raise the question of whether the pendulum has swung too far to where we do this kind of formal education, but we don't include, as a matter of course, the kind of formative aspect of work. And I mean that in the apprenticing sense, in the following adults around and wanting, like you're saying, wanting to naturally be engaged in the things that they're doing. I certainly think the work of Maria Montessori on this question about work and in the formation of young people needs to be taken more seriously. It's so interesting. And then certainly something that came out of these testimonies was women spoke frequently with a lot of praise about the types of work that their children engaged in. Again, not backbreaking work, but sort of, you've got three babies in your arms. And so the 10-year-old is going to jump in there and put a baby to bed or change a diaper. And so that just has this formative effect on character, which turns out to be desirable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and also, I just wanted, something you and I didn't
Mhm.
talk about ahead of time, Aaron, but that I think is really interesting for this conversation is also that we don't teach about the domestic sphere in our formal
Mm-mm.
education. So we
That's
don't,
right.
home economics has more or less disappeared. I personally think it should be taught in middle school,
Yeah.
not wait until high school, and just everything from how to cook.
Right.
No kid should turn 18 without having at least 10 things they can cook for themselves.
Yeah.
And what's it feel like to hold a baby? And what do you need to know about dyad formation, and mating
Right.
dynamics? What do you need
Yeah.
to know about yourself as a person? Everything's focused on market economy metrics, you
Hmm.
know, and not about how to be a really great person and how to have a really meaningful life. And I think we could do that in a secular way.
Yes.
Also, so anyway, those are some of the things that did. Any of the women, did that come up at all in terms of home economics and schools and your background in
Yeah.
education? I'm just wondering what you have to say about that.
Yeah. I would say that I think the most profound explicit mention of what you're raising came up in the lengthier treatment of my interview with Hannah and Esther. So not the first chapter or the second chapter, but when they come back again in chapter 13, I think. And there was a point when I remember particularly Hannah's stance. We were talking in her living room and she's standing because she's kind of watching her toddler. And we started to talk about marriage. And so this is to your point, Catherine, about the dyad and the family dynamics and how to be a good partner, even. And, I kind of asked them this question, like, do kids ruin your marriage? And I don't have the transcript in front of me, but I remember she said, I have such a strong thought on this. She like wanted to declare something. She was very bold. And she said, what do you know about it? And she said, like people who become doctors or they become, whatever they train for professionally, they've studied for 8, 10, 12 years to be that thing.
Yep.
But how much time do you spend studying to be a good wife or husband, a
Yeah.
good parent, right? And she just said, this is ridiculous. These things are more important to human life. We spend no time studying them.
Mhm.
And that to me I just thought like, oh my goodness, that's an amazing point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Very
I
much
think
so.
that's very much what you're raising. And that's not a hard point to understand, right? Like we all
Right.
get that our relationships are central to our happiness and it's not anywhere in the program. It's not in the
Mhm.
program. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. What's in the program is what are you going to do for work
Yeah.
once you graduate with your college degree?
Yeah.
I think it would surprise our audience
Hmm.
to know just how many of these women, including yourself,
Hmm.
who have had 5+ children, have also had very successful and very fulfilling careers. So,
Yeah.
What are some of the themes that you found among these women in terms of integrating career with motherhood?
Yeah. Okay, great question. A couple of things. Up front, I want to make it clear, and I think it comes out if you do read the whole book, that there isn't one way.
Hmm. Hmm.
There isn't one way, ranging from women who felt not only called but inspired to walk away from their professional training to women who were so so fully professionals that they're in the one case, dad stayed home full time. I thought that was important, that there's no one single way to organize it. But as we talked about before, it was kind of an attitude rather than a particular path. And the attitude was kind of like, this is what's most important to me. And so I've sometimes used the language of quietly arranging their lives to be able to take the next child, if so blessed or if so inspired, right? So if they felt ready, what did that look like? It meant opting into careers or professional paths which had that kind of flexibility, right? And so certainly, I mean, in the kind of public conversation we're having now, oftentimes that is something that more college education, women with more professional status can sometimes achieve, actually, right? We're not slotted into like a work schedule that's being just arranged by the local boss, but we're right. So small business owners, and we can create these flexible lives. So the pattern was kind of that was like, I kind of know what my priority is, and I'm going to pick types of work that would allow me to be able to accept children if I'm inspired to seek the next one. Think if I'm missing something, but I think that was the main way it came across.
Hmm.
Rather than say, like you've signed up for something that I can't. If I decide next year I'd really love to have a child, I can't walk away from this job because there's a mortgage on the line, there's a payment of some kind, there's a team at work I'm going to let down. So kind of seeking that out, but of course there's no one way, and um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of in wrapping up a bit here,
Hmm.
most of the women you interviewed had made the choice to have family for religious reasons.
Hmm.
And we've sort of hinted at it a little bit in our conversation,
Yeah.
but apart from converting to a religion,
Hmm.
what are some of the motivating values a secular woman could embrace to get to a similar place?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the insight, so we should be clear for maybe your listeners who haven't read the book. When we say religious reasons, we don't mean that they believed that their religion told them they have to have children. And
Hmm.
make that really
Hmm.
clear.
That's important. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
because I
do
think
make that
that's a
very
common
clear.
perception. Like maybe the Pope says you have to have a lot of kids, or the rabbi, or whatever. Mm.
Right.
And that's not what I heard. When we say religious reasons, that there was some truth inside of their faith, which they really had had come to embrace as a conviction. And typically that was a kind of an expression of the intrinsic goodness of a child, that a child is always worth having in a sense if you can accommodate the child. And I think that's accessible outside of faith. I do. But it does require, I think, some creativity. So I think there are frequently going to be things that, so we think about this in terms of like a pro-life or a pro-abortion culture. I don't think you have to be a religious person to recognize that the child in the womb is a unique human person, but it helps. I mean, like, it helps, right? I don't think you have to be a religious person to see that no one should be a slave or should be enslaved or owned by another person. But it sure helps, right? The greatest abolitionists are people who are really motivated by faith. So I think that's the way I would want to put it, that these are things that are, so somebody who's not a deeply religious person could, through experience, having a child and coming to see, gosh, this is so rewarding. And I happen to be free. I could do another one. And, just sort of falling in love with having children. I heard some of that even in women who had a religious perspective. I do think that talking about these things, I've sometimes put it, telling the stories of our children, telling exactly why we had the next child or or the things that were surprising. I think that can help because I think these are human experiences. And so if we thought about well, people who didn't have faith or didn't share our faith, would it still be worth talking? Yeah, I think 100% it's worth talking about because insofar as these are things that are in our nature, they're accessible to people of goodwill who recognize something deeply human about the experience of motherhood and family. And at the very least, it's something you can share with, like you said, your ancestors and so many other people across cultures. So yeah, I think there's plenty there, but that we are coming out. I think we're not still in it deeply, but we're coming out of this kind of weird place where we didn't share these stories. I think it was, I don't know, it was a thing we were into for a while. We were going to talk about, I don't know, working on Wall Street or things like that. But yeah, I mean, it just moved the last couple of weeks. It was National Down Syndrome Day or World Down Syndrome Day. I don't know which one it was, but reading just some of the stories that women were posting and men were posting about their children with Down syndrome. Why were they posting them? Because it was an awareness. It was a period of awareness. And so talking about these things can really help. It could create a sense that there's something worth paying attention to. And even if not everybody would want to do this. Yeah. I mean, just as a funny point, one of my girlfriends years ago, she said, I never really knew anything about persons with Down syndrome, but my husband grew up with his younger brother. And she said the stories that he told us about how much joy his younger brother brought to their family, she said, I just thought, well, I hope we can have a child with Down syndrome.
Mhm.
And I remember thinking, wait, what? Like, you'd want that? She said, but I mean, have you heard his stories? Like, his brother is like the most treasured possession of their family. And this wasn't a religious insight. It was an insight really born out of a very beautiful human experience. And it really gave me pause. I thought, wow, you could come to want to have a child with a disability because of all of these human reasons. So I think telling the stories, I think that for me, that's worth doing.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'm so glad that you've chosen to share these stories in this way
Mm,
with us in this book. I love how balanced the book is with really heartfelt stories,
mhm.
personal stories, and yet a lot of good data. And
Yeah.
you really draw a beautiful picture of some of the choices we really have to make as a culture. So thank you for your good work. And yeah,
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
thank
It
you.
was really a pleasure to meet you across the country. I hope we'll
Yeah,
meet in person at some point.
I
I
hope
hope
so
so
too.
too. Yeah,
Thank
I mean,
you,
we could have done
Catherine.
an entire other episode on some of your thoughts from a policy perspective. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
maybe we'll have to do that in the future and check in
Sure.
with you.
Thanks so
yeah.
much.